Before sunrise on June 4, 1942, the vast Pacific lay quiet, hiding the forces that were about to collide. On the flight decks of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, young aviators waited in silence. Some were already strapped into their cockpits, steadying their breath as the humid ocean air filled their lungs. Others remained below deck, seated in briefing rooms, reviewing attack plans and memorizing target layouts for what they believed would be a decisive mission. Across the carriers, ground crews and mechanics worked with practiced urgency, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, and preparing aircraft for launch, unaware that these machines were moments away from changing the course of history. What none of them knew was that far beyond the horizon, nearly 240 miles to the northeast, 3 American aircraft carriers were already maneuvering into position. Their decks, too, were turning into the wind. Their aircraft, too, were being readied for battle. Within hours, 2 naval powers would clash in what was intended to be Japan's final blow against American carrier strength in the Pacific. Instead, it would become the most devastating defeat the Imperial Navy would ever suffer. By the end of that single day, 4 Japanese carriers, the same ships that had delivered victory at Pearl Harbor, would be lost beneath the sea. Along with them vanished more than metal and fuel. Over 3,000 highly trained pilots, aircrew, and sailors, men who could not be quickly replaced, would perish. Even more critically, Japan's vision of uncontested expansion across the Pacific would be shattered. This battle marked the end of 6 uninterrupted months of triumph. For the first time, the war would turn decisively against Japan. This account approaches that turning point not from the perspective of the victors, but from those who endured defeat, the admirals who conceived the operation, the pilots who carried it out, and the sailors who never returned. This was the Battle of Midway. The story begins earlier, in the spring of 1942, roughly 2 months before the catastrophe. In Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, found himself embroiled in bitter disputes with the Naval General Staff. Despite the confident image presented to the public, deep concerns plagued Japan's naval leadership. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December had been a stunning tactical success, yet it carried a critical failure that Yamamoto could never ignore. Not a single American aircraft carrier had been destroyed. At the time of the attack, the USS Enterprise and USS Lexington were not in harbor. 6 months later, American carriers continued to operate freely, striking Japanese positions across the Pacific with increasing boldness. This unresolved threat weighed heavily on Yamamoto, who understood that as long as American carrier forces survived, Japan's strategic position remained dangerously fragile. Then came April 18, 1942. In an unprecedented act, American B-25 bombers launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet and appeared over the Japanese home islands. Tokyo itself came under attack. Although the physical damage was limited, the symbolic impact was enormous. The raid represented a profound humiliation for a military establishment that had promised absolute protection of the emperor and the homeland. The Doolittle raid sent shockwaves through Japan's leadership. It exposed vulnerabilities that had previously been unthinkable and triggered a crisis of confidence at the highest levels of command. Accountability was demanded. For Yamamoto, the message was unmistakable. The American carrier threat had to be eliminated completely and decisively, or Japan would face consequences far beyond a single raid. Midway would be the answer, and it would decide the fate of the Pacific War. Vice Admiral Chichi Nagumo, the officer who had commanded Japan's carrier force during the strike on Pearl Harbor, found himself under intense psychological strain. Within months, his reputation had come under sustained attack. Critics blamed him for failing to launch a third wave against Pearl Harbor's fuel depots and repair facilities, for missing the American aircraft carriers entirely, and now most humiliating of all, for allowing the Japanese home islands to be struck by enemy bombers. The shock of the Doolittle raid reverberated through Tokyo's military leadership, creating an overwhelming demand for a decisive response. Yet, as was typical within Japan's wartime command structure, unity was absent. Deep fractures divided senior leaders, and rival strategic visions competed behind closed doors. One faction, centered around the Naval General Staff, favored caution. They argued for a continued focus on the southern theater, reinforcing Japanese positions in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, and tightening the noose around Australia by severing its supply routes to the United States. This approach emphasized consolidation over risk. Admiral Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, rejected this defensive mindset. His outlook was shaped not only by strategic calculation, but by a grim sense of urgency. Yamamoto understood a reality that many of his peers either underestimated or chose to ignore. Japan was racing against time. Unlike most senior Japanese officers, Yamamoto had lived in the United States. As a student at Harvard and later as a naval attaché, he had observed American power at its source. He had walked past vast steel complexes, watched massive ships taking shape in sprawling naval yards, and witnessed agricultural regions capable of sustaining an industrial workforce of staggering size. He knew that once the United States fully mobilized its economy, Japan's chances of long-term survival would diminish rapidly. Years earlier, in a recorded exchange with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe in 1940, Yamamoto had spoken with blunt honesty. He stated that Japan could fight fiercely for half a year if war were forced upon it, but beyond that window he had no faith in ultimate success should the conflict drag on. This was not bravado but warning. In another verified remark made shortly before the outbreak of war, Yamamoto predicted that Japan would initially expand rapidly, dominating vast areas of the Pacific, but that this momentum would peak within 18 months before reversing. From this assessment emerged Yamamoto's proposed solution, Operation MI. At the center of the plan stood Midway Atoll, a remote cluster of coral islands, barely 6 square miles in total area. Though insignificant in appearance, its location gave it immense strategic value. Situated roughly 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, Midway functioned as the United States forward outpost in the Central Pacific, supporting submarine operations and long-range air patrols. For Yamamoto, however, Midway's true importance lay not in its facilities, but in its psychological and operational potential. He intended to use the atoll as a lure. An attack on Midway, he believed, would compel the U.S. Navy to commit its remaining aircraft carriers to defend the position. Once those carriers left the safety of Pearl Harbor, Japan's superior fleet would intercept and annihilate them in a single decisive engagement, the long-anticipated Kantai-Kessen, the climactic naval battle envisioned by Japanese doctrine for decades. The plan itself was extraordinarily ambitious and dangerously intricate. It required multiple task forces to operate in precise coordination across thousands of miles of open ocean. One group would conduct the actual invasion of Midway, another would provide carrier-based air power to eliminate American defenses. A separate main battle fleet, including Yamamoto's flagship, the colossal battleship Yamato, would follow behind. To further complicate matters, a diversionary assault was planned against the Aleutian Islands, intended to mislead American intelligence and divide their response. Altogether, nearly 200 vessels were assigned to the operation, making it the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled. The sheer scale of the undertaking was matched by its administrative burden. The official operations order stretched to roughly 700 pages and was distributed only days before departure, leaving subordinate commanders with little opportunity to fully absorb or question its contents. Opposition within the Navy was widespread, but ultimately ineffective. Even Yamamoto's own Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Matome Yugaki, harbored serious concerns. During war games conducted in early May, simulated outcomes revealed troubling possibilities. In these exercises, American carriers arrived earlier than anticipated and inflicted heavy losses on Japanese forces. Rather than prompting a reassessment, the results were dismissed. The umpires overseeing the simulations intervened directly, reducing American successes on paper and restoring Japanese ships that had been sunk during the exercise. The warnings were recorded, then ignored. With doubts suppressed and preparations rushed, Japan sailed toward Midway, convinced that one final, decisive stroke could still change the course of the war. Long before the first aircraft rose from Japanese flight decks, warning signs were already visible, ignored by a navy intoxicated by its own success. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, the gifted strategist behind the Pearl Harbor strike, openly questioned the Midway operation. He warned that the plan was dangerously intricate and that Japan's carriers were being exposed far beyond acceptable risk. His concerns were brushed aside. By mid-1942, the Imperial Navy was suffering from what many historians later called victory sickness, a lethal confidence forged by 6 months of rapid, seemingly effortless expansion across the Pacific. Even Japan's sharpest officers were no longer immune to the belief that their enemy was already broken. This overconfidence was reinforced by flawed intelligence. Japanese commanders believed that during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, they had eliminated 2 American fleet carriers. In reality, only USS Lexington had been lost. USS Yorktown, though heavily damaged, had survived. Japanese analysts assumed Yorktown would be sidelined for many months. What they did not know was unfolding at Pearl Harbor. In an extraordinary feat of logistics and determination, nearly 1,400 dockyard workers labored non-stop, day and night. Against all expectations and far beyond what Japanese yards believed possible, Yorktown was restored to combat readiness in just 3 days. This effort went completely unnoticed by. As a result, Japan calculated that the United States could muster no more than 2 operational carriers to oppose the coming attack. Command of the carrier strike force rested with Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a man burdened by doubt he rarely voiced publicly. Nagumo was not an aviator. He was a torpedo specialist by training, elevated to leadership primarily through seniority rather than expertise in carrier warfare. Naval aviation had never sat comfortably with him. His cautious instincts had already shaped history. At Pearl Harbor, it was Nagumo who halted the operation after 2 strikes, refusing to authorize a 3rd attack that might have destroyed American fuel reserves and repair facilities targets whose survival would later prove decisive. Now, he faced an even more complex mission with a force that was visibly worn down. Since December 1941, his carriers had barely left the sea. They had struck Darwin, raided Ceylon, supported operations across the Indian Ocean, and fought at Coral Sea. The toll was unmistakable. Flight crews were exhausted, aircraft were worn. Ships desperately needed maintenance. The recent Coral Sea battle, though claimed as a tactical success, had inflicted serious strategic damage on Japan. Shokaku had suffered heavy bomb damage and would require months in dry dock. Zuikaku, though physically intact, had lost so many experienced pilots and aircraft that she was effectively combat inactive. 2 of Japan's finest carriers would be absent from the upcoming operation. Privately, Nagumo confessed his unease to his chief of staff, Captain Rinosuke Kusaka. He warned that the fleet was being stretched beyond its limits. The Americans, he believed, had been given time to regroup. Japanese pilots were fatigued, and worst of all, the location of the enemy carriers remained unknown. In his view, Admiral Yamamoto was placing the Empire's future on a dangerous wager. Yet the most critical weakness in the Japanese plan was neither material nor operational. It was intellectual. Unbeknownst to Tokyo, American cryptanalysts had penetrated the Japanese Navy's most important operational code, JN-25B. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had been deciphering Japanese communications since early 1942. They identified Operation MI, determined that the objective was Midway, and through the famous AF water shortage ruse confirmed it beyond doubt. When Midway transmitted a false report about failing desalination equipment via secure cable, Japanese intercepts soon repeated the claim. The trap had worked. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz now possessed a near-complete picture of Japanese intentions, force composition, and timing. American carriers were positioned accordingly. Meanwhile, Japan's defensive measures quietly collapsed. The submarine picket line intended to detect American ships departing Pearl Harbor arrived too late. The U.S. carriers had already slipped through undetected. A planned long-range reconnaissance mission, Operation K, was cancelled when a Japanese submarine discovered American warships occupying French frigate shoals, the seaplane refueling point. This location had been successfully used months earlier during a limited bombing raid on Hawaii. But Nimitz had learned from that incident and ensured the vulnerability would not be repeated. One by one, Japan's eyes went blind. There were signs radio intercepts showing increased American submarine activity, unusual message traffic near Midway, and the troubling ease with which U.S. forces had located Japanese units at Coral Sea. Some officers quietly wondered if the codes had been compromised. These doubts were dismissed. As one staff officer reportedly scoffed, the Americans were considered too incompetent to break Japanese encryption and too timid to fight without overwhelming advantage. The prevailing belief was simple: the United States would only approach after Midway had fallen and would then be annihilated. On May 27, 1942, deliberately chosen to coincide with the anniversary of Admiral Togo's triumph at Tsushima, the Kido Butai sailed from Japan's inland sea. 4 fleet carriers formed the core of the force. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship and former command of Yamamoto. Kaga, a converted battleship turned carrier. Hairi, the flying dragon. Sori, the blue-green dragon. Together, they carried nearly 250 aircraft and the most seasoned naval aviators on Earth, the same force that had shattered Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific and Indian Oceans with apparent invincibility. To many within the Imperial Navy, defeat seemed unthinkable. Still recovering from an emergency appendectomy, Minoru Genda remained aboard as air operations officer, his body weak but his mind sharp. Before departure, he made a final entry in his diary, one that history would later read with chilling clarity. The die had been cast. The Japanese fleet departed under a shadow of unease. Among senior officers, there was an unspoken sense that this mission had been assembled too hastily. Intelligence assessments were incomplete, assumptions overly optimistic, and the operational design dangerously intricate. Yet for the men involved, hesitation was not an option. They were bound by duty and tradition, prepared to carry out their orders regardless of the outcome, even if that outcome was death. Quiet prayers were offered for Japan, for many aboard felt that disaster lay somewhere ahead. This underlying flaw, confidence bordering on arrogance, was later reflected in the circumstances surrounding Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the aviator who had commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor. In late May, while aboard the carrier Akagi, Fuchida suffered acute appendicitis and was rushed into emergency surgery. Though the procedure was successful, it left him physically incapable of flying. As a result, the Japanese Navy entered its most decisive battle without one of its most seasoned air leaders. Confined to his recovery quarters, Fuchida observed the preparations from a distance. According to recollections by fellow officers, he grew increasingly troubled. The timing felt off, the plan seemed unnecessarily complicated. Even the atmosphere aboard the ship felt heavy, as though warning them of an approaching calamity. That said, modern historians urge caution when evaluating Fuchida's post-war reflections. Many of his later claims have been disputed, and his personal testimony cannot always be independently verified. Before dawn on June 3, while the main carrier force continued its approach, the northern phase of the Japanese operation was already underway. Roughly 600 miles to the north, the campaign against the Aleutian Islands commenced. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta led a secondary carrier group built around the light carriers Ria and Junio, launching air attacks against Dutch Harbor in Alaska. This northern strike was intended as a grand diversion, one that Japanese planners believed would lure American naval forces away from Midway. What the Japanese did not realize was that the deception had failed completely. U.S. naval intelligence, guided by successful code-breaking efforts, had already uncovered the true objective of the operation. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was fully aware that Midway, not Alaska, was the real target. As a result, American carriers remained concentrated near the island, ignoring the northern distraction entirely. The elaborate ruse succeeded only in misleading those who conceived it. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier force pressed forward through dense fog, maintaining strict radio silence. While this secrecy protected the fleet from detection, it also ensured that the widely dispersed Japanese task groups would be unable to coordinate once the battle began. Inside the carrier's briefing rooms, Japanese pilots received their final instructions. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, assigned to lead the first strike against Midway, carefully reviewed reconnaissance photographs taken weeks earlier. The images showed airstrips, fuel depots, and defensive positions, but they failed to reveal recent American reinforcements. New fighter squadrons, additional bombers, and most importantly, a radar installation now stood ready to detect incoming aircraft long before they reached the island. By the time the Japanese strike force would be spotted, it would still be more than 90 miles away. Later that evening, American patrol aircraft made the first breakthrough. PBY Catalina flying boats operating out of Midway detected elements of the Japanese invasion force approximately 700 miles to the west. At 925 hours, one pilot transmitted a concise but electrifying report, a major enemy formation bearing 262 degrees at extreme distance. The message sent a surge of urgency through the American command structure. Nagumo's carrier group, however, remained hidden, shielded by weather conditions and sheer distance. On the bridge of Akagi, tension filled the air. Chief of Staff Rinosuke Kusaka quietly raised his concerns, suggesting that the sighting of the invasion force might mean the Americans were more prepared than anticipated. Nagumo brushed the warning aside. The invasion force, he insisted, was meant to be discovered. It would provoke an American response. Midway's air power would be destroyed the following morning, and any USS carriers that attempted to intervene would be eliminated in turn. Yet even as Nagumo expressed confidence, events were unfolding beyond his awareness. Hundreds of miles to the northeast, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard USS Enterprise was calculating the most likely position of the Japanese carriers. Thanks to intelligence and careful planning, the American fleet was exactly where Japanese doctrine said it should not be. Task Force 16, composed of Enterprise and Hornet, and Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, including the hastily repaired Yorktown, had already assembled at their rendezvous point northeast of Midway, completely undetected by Japanese reconnaissance. The sea was calm, the sky clear, and visibility excellent, ideal conditions for carrier aviation. At precisely 4:30 on June 4th, the carriers Akagi and Kaga began launching their first attack wave. The operation proceeded efficiently and without incident. The strike consisted of 36 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers configured for level bombing, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. Lieutenant Tominaga led the formation into the brightening morning sky. After circling once above the fleet, the aircraft turned southeast toward Midway, some 240 miles away. As the strike departed, Nagumo made what would become the most consequential decision of the battle. Contrary to established doctrine, which emphasized committing maximum force in a single overwhelming blow, he chose to retain a second group of 108 aircraft aboard the carriers. These planes, armed with torpedoes and heavy armor-piercing bombs, were held in reserve in case American warships appeared unexpectedly. On the surface, the decision appeared cautious and sensible. In reality, it would prove disastrous. Deep within Akagi, Commander Fuchida watched the launch from his recovery bed, weakened and unable to participate. His absence deprived the fleet of a commander whose experience and decisiveness might have altered the course of events. Fellow officers later recalled his visible unease as the operation unfolded, an intuition that something fundamental was wrong, though his precise remarks remain undocumented in contemporary records. Within hours, those unspoken fears would be tragically confirmed. Shortly after dawn, at approximately 500 hours, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo initiated the reconnaissance phase of the operation. From his 4 carriers, only 7 search aircraft were dispatched to scan an immense stretch of the Pacific, an area far too large for such limited coverage. Across the ocean, the Americans operated under very different conditions. More than 30 long-range PBY Catalina flying boats were already sweeping the seas in overlapping patterns, actively hunting for the Japanese task force. One decision, however, would prove disproportionately significant. A scout plane launched from the heavy cruiser Tone, identified as Scout Number 4, was assigned responsibility for the sector that, by fate, contained the American carrier groups. This aircraft did not depart on schedule. Its launch was delayed by roughly 30 minutes. Official explanations later ranged from malfunctioning catapult equipment to engine difficulties, while some historians have suggested procedural or administrative hesitation. Whatever the cause, this single delay would ripple forward with catastrophic consequences. Ironically, modern analysis has raised an unsettling possibility. Even if the scout had departed on time, the geometry of its assigned search pattern may still have failed to detect the American carriers. Chance, as much as error, played its role. At 534, fortune favored the Americans. Lieutenant Howard Adey, piloting a PBY Catalina, sighted the Japanese carrier force and immediately transmitted a brief but explosive report: enemy carriers. 18 minutes later, at 552, he followed up with precise tactical data: 2 aircraft carriers accompanied by battleships, bearing 320 degrees, approximately 180 miles distant, moving southeast at 25 knots. Aboard the carrier Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance was confronted with a stark choice. The enemy was at the extreme edge of operational range, nearly 200 miles away. Launching a strike meant that returning aircraft would have almost no margin for error in fuel consumption. Nevertheless, Spruance acted decisively. He ordered an immediate attack, reasoning that the Japanese carriers were most exposed while recovering aircraft from their Midway strike. The risk was immense, but the potential reward was decisive. While American carrier aircraft prepared to launch, Midway itself came under imminent threat. At 553, the island's radar station detected the inbound Japanese strike force at a distance of 93 miles. Air raid sirens echoed across the small coral atoll. Every available aircraft was rushed into the air bombers tasked with attacking the Japanese fleet and fighters assigned to defend the island. The Marine fighter contingent was badly outmatched. 20 aging Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and 7 Grumman 4F Wildcats climbed to intercept a vastly superior force of escorting Mitsubishi A6M0s. The engagement began at 616. Major Floyd Parks, commanding the Marine Defenders, made his final radio call as combat was joined. What followed was brutally one-sided. The Japanese pilots, highly experienced and flying aircraft with superior maneuverability, tore into the Marine formation. In a matter of minutes, 13 American fighters were destroyed and 4 more crippled. Major Parks was killed. Japanese losses amounted to just 3 aircraft. By 630, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's strike group reached Midway. Dive bombers and level bombers attacked with disciplined precision, igniting fuel storage areas, destroying infrastructure, and gouging deep scars into the runway. Yet, as Tomonaga circled to evaluate the results, an alarming sight confronted him. American aircraft was still lifting off from the airfield. Despite damage, the runway remained functional. Even more critically, no aircraft had been caught on the ground. Midway's defenders had launched everything before the bombs fell. At 700, Tomonaga radioed Nagumo with an urgent assessment. A follow-up strike was necessary. That message arrived at precisely the wrong moment. Just as Nagumo received Tomonaga's report, the first American aircraft from Midway began attacking the Japanese fleet. 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 B-26 Marauders approached at low altitude. Japanese combat air patrol fighters descended on them immediately. 5 Avengers were shot down, along with 2 B-26 seconds. 1 Marauder, however, flown by Lieutenant James Murray and known as Susie Q, executed a near-suicidal attack run. After releasing its torpedo, the aircraft roared directly toward the carrier Akagi. Japanese eyewitnesses, including officers on the bridge, later recalled the bomber racing down the length of the flight deck, its machine guns firing, killing 2 sailors. The plane pulled up only at the last possible moment, narrowly clearing the bridge where Nagumo and his staff instinctively ducked. Murray's aircraft was riddled with more than 500 bullet holes and hemorrhaging hydraulic fluid, yet it somehow staggered back to Midway. Another B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Herbert Mays, was so badly damaged that it crashed into the sea near Akagi's bridge, possibly in an intentional attempt to ram the ship. The psychological impact was severe. Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka later recalled that Nagumo was visibly shaken. To witness an enemy aircraft nearly collide with the flagship's bridge felt, in his words, like a divine warning. American attacks did not cease. Marine dive bombers from VMSB 241 pressed forward, followed by high-altitude Army bombers and additional Marine Vindicators. Major Lofton Henderson led one such group and was killed in action. None of these attacks scored direct hits, and losses were heavy, but they achieved a critical operational effect. The Japanese carriers were forced into constant evasive maneuvers, making sustained flight operations nearly impossible. At 7:15, Nagumo confronted the defining decision of the battle. His reserve aircraft were armed for naval combat torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs designed for enemy ships. Yet Midway had not been neutralized, and no confirmed report of American carriers had been received. After intense debate with his staff, Nagumo issued the order that would doom his force. The reserve planes were to be rearmed for a second land attack. This decision directly contradicted Admiral Yamamoto's standing orders to maintain readiness for anti-ship engagement. Below decks, chaos followed. Ordnance crews began removing Type 91 torpedoes and 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with lighter land attack weapons. With time running out, safety regulations were ignored. Removed torpedoes were stacked in the hangars instead of being returned to deep magazines. Bombs lay scattered near fueled aircraft. Fuel lines crisscrossed the decks. One surviving mechanic would later describe the scene as a floating powder keg one spark away from annihilation. At 7:28, the delayed scout plane from Tone finally transmitted its report. It had sighted what appeared to be 10 enemy surface vessels bearing 10 degrees, approximately 240 miles from Midway, moving southeast at more than 20 knots. Nagumo immediately ordered clarification of ship types. The response took 12 agonizing minutes. During that time, rearming continued and the hangar decks grew even more dangerously congested. At 7:45, yet another wave of American aircraft arrived, Marine dive bombers once again led from VMSB 241. Japanese fighters shot down 8 of the attackers, but the relentless pressure continued, forcing violent evasive action and further delaying any Japanese counterstrike. By this moment, the stage was set. The carriers of the Kido Butai were crowded with fueled aircraft and exposed ordnance, their decks unusable, their defenses stretched thin. The battle's decisive moment was approaching. Nagumo now finds himself facing a dilemma with no good answers. His carrier force has been under relentless pressure for hours. Fighter squadrons are burning through fuel and ammunition while fending off repeated waves of enemy aircraft. Below deck, crews work frantically as Tomonaga's strike group, itself dangerously low on fuel, is expected to return at any moment. Flight decks are cluttered with aircraft in various stages of preparation, some loaded with bombs, others awaiting torpedoes, many still unarmed. Beyond the horizon, somewhere in the vastness of the Pacific, American surface forces are believed to be closing in. The possibility of enemy carriers cannot be dismissed. At 8:09, the long-delayed report from Scout Plane No. 4 finally arrives and offers partial clarity. The enemy force, it states, consists of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. For a brief moment, Nagumo exhales. No carriers are mentioned. Reassured, he allows preparations for a second strike against Midway to continue. That calm lasts barely 11 minutes. At 8:20, a follow-up transmission arrives and with it, disaster. The scout now reports that the enemy formation appears to include an aircraft carrier. The news spreads rapidly through the flagship. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division aboard Hiyu, immediately grasps the danger. At 8:30, he signals Nagumo with an urgent recommendation. Launch an attack at once. Delay, Yamaguchi warns implicitly, only increases the risk. The enemy has been located. Hesitation could prove fatal. Yamaguchi is known for his aggressive mindset. To him, the situation is unmistakable. Every passing minute leaves the Japanese carriers more exposed, yet Nagumo hesitates, and not without reason. His air groups are in disarray. Some aircraft carry bombs meant for land targets, others are fitted for anti-ship attacks, and many have no ordnance at all. Fighter units are airborne or dangerously low on fuel and must land soon. Meanwhile, Tomonaga's returning planes are closing in and their recovery cannot be postponed. Launching an attack immediately would mean sending out an incomplete, poorly coordinated force, largely without fighter escort. Such an action would violate the very core of Japanese naval aviation doctrine, which emphasized massed, synchronized strikes. Despite suffering from complications following an appendectomy, Commander Minoru Genda is consulted. According to later testimony from staff officers, Genda argues strongly in favor of immediate action. Speed, he insists, is now the decisive factor. Whatever aircraft are ready should be launched without delay. Captain Rinosuke Kusaka counters with a more conservative view. A fragmented attack, he warns, risks heavy losses while achieving little. Better to recover all returning aircraft, rearm them correctly, refuel, and strike with overwhelming force exactly as doctrine prescribes. Nagumo, a commander known for caution and strict adherence to established procedures, sides with Kusaka. The decision is made. All carriers are signaled, recover Tomonaga's strike group, complete rearming and refueling, then advance north and engage the enemy with full strength. On paper, the decision appears rational. In reality, it is catastrophic. Beginning at 8:37, Tomonaga's aircraft begin landing. As they are moved below decks for servicing, the hangars transform into lethal environments. Fuel hoses snake across the floors. Bombs and torpedoes lie unsecured. Aircraft are shifted constantly by elevators moving up and down in an endless cycle. Normal safety measures are abandoned under the pressure to prepare for the next launch as quickly as possible. No one notices the distant specks approaching at low altitude. At 9:20, the first American carrier aircraft reached the Japanese fleet. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, press forward. They have no fighter escort. Their aircraft are slow, obsolete, and barely capable of exceeding 100 knots. Flying just above the waves, they head straight into the heart of the Japanese formation. For hours, Japanese Zero fighters have been engaged against land-based threats. Now, at last, they find vulnerable prey. They dive from above with devastating effect. The torpedo bombers are cut down one after another. None escape. All 15 aircraft are destroyed. Of the 30 crewmen who took part, only one survives, Ensign George Gay. He will remain afloat in the ocean, concealed beneath his seat cushion, witnessing the rest of the battle from the water. Not a single torpedo strikes its target. Yet the sacrifice has consequences. At 9:54, 14 more Devastators from Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 arrive, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. Once again, Japanese fighters descend en masse. 10 of the aircraft are shot down, 4 manage to withdraw. Again, no hits are scored. At 10:12, the pattern repeats. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, makes its attack. 10 more aircraft fall from the sky. Still, no torpedoes find their mark. In total, 41 American torpedo bombers have attacked. Only 6 survive. From every visible perspective, the assault appears to be an unmitigated disaster. Aboard Akagi, there is relief and even quiet celebration. The American carrier attacks seem to have been crushed at enormous cost. Confident once more, Nagumo orders preparations to launch his own strike at 10:30. Victory appears close at hand. What no one on the Japanese bridges realizes is that far above, unseen and unopposed, with every Zero drawn down to sea level, 2 formations of SPD Dauntless dive bombers are arriving at the same moment. And the balance of the war is about to change. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding a strike force of 33 SPD Dauntless dive bombers launched from USS Enterprise, found himself flying far beyond the interception point calculated before takeoff. Every mile increased the risk that his aircraft would run out of fuel before locating the enemy. Despite this, McCluskey pressed on, making a deliberate gamble that would soon alter the course of the Pacific War. His decision was rewarded when he noticed a single Japanese destroyer, Arashi, racing northward at high speed. Moments earlier, the destroyer had been attacking the American submarine USS Nautilus with depth charges. Once the submarine slipped away, Arashi rejoined the main Japanese carrier formation, unknowingly leaving behind a visible trail that pointed directly to the heart of the Kido Butai. At nearly the same time, a second group of American dive bombers, 17 aircraft from USS Yorktown under the command of Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, approached the Japanese fleet from an entirely different direction. By sheer coincidence and precise timing, both American formations arrived over the enemy carriers within moments of one another. At 10:20 in the morning, Japanese lookouts aboard the carrier Kaga suddenly shouted warnings as they spotted aircraft diving out of the sky. The cry, "Dive bombers," came seconds too late. Japanese fighter cover had been drawn down to sea level, chasing American torpedo planes earlier in the battle. The carrier decks below were crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft, while hangar spaces were packed with bombs, torpedoes, and aviation fuel. The Japanese fleet was caught at its most exposed state. 2 minutes later, at 10:22, McCluskey tipped his aircraft forward from an altitude of roughly 14,500 feet and began his dive. One after another, his squadrons followed, rolling inverted and plunging toward their targets. Below them, the red rising sun markings painted on the carrier decks expanded rapidly in the clear Pacific air, becoming unmistakable aiming points. McCluskey directed his attack against Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best peeled away with his section to strike Akagi, the Japanese flagship. Almost simultaneously, Leslie's Yorktown bombers descended upon Soryu. The results were devastating. Kaga was struck by 4 bombs in quick succession. The first, a 1,000-pound bomb, detonated near the bridge at approximately 10:22, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and much of his senior command instantly. Another bomb punched through the flight deck amidships and exploded inside the hangar, igniting fueled aircraft and triggering a chain of secondary blasts. The remaining bombs transformed the carrier into a raging inferno within minutes. Ammunition detonated uncontrollably, and burning aviation fuel produced towering walls of fire. Kaga quickly became a blazing wreck, doomed beyond recovery. Akagi suffered only a single direct hit from Lieutenant Best's bomb at approximately 10:24, but the effect was catastrophic. The bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar, where 18 aircraft were being refueled and rearmed. Poorly stored munitions amplified the blast. Torpedoes detonated, bombs exploded in sequence, and fuel-fed fires spread with terrifying speed. Reports from bridge personnel indicated that within 2 minutes, temperatures inside the hangar exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius, rendering any firefighting efforts impossible. At 10:25, Soryu was struck by 3 bombs that detonated inside her hangar spaces. Leslie's pilots delivered their payloads with remarkable accuracy. Aircraft parked on the flight deck Valdive bombers, Zero fighters, and Kate torpedo planes were torn apart instantly. Below deck, stacks of torpedoes and bombs erupted in violent secondary explosions, ripping through the ship's internal structure. Soryu's commanding officer, Captain Ryusaku Yamamoto, refused repeated orders to abandon ship. According to Chief Petty Officer Abe, who was dispatched to escort him to safety, Yamamoto remained on the bridge as flames consumed the superstructure. Witnesses later reported that he stood with his sword drawn, singing Japan's national anthem Kimigayo until the fire overtook him. Only one Japanese carrier, Hiryu, escaped immediate destruction. Positioned several miles away and partially concealed by cloud cover, she survived the initial onslaught. Her commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, reacted without hesitation. Though 3/4 of Japan's carrier striking force had been eliminated in less than 5 minutes, he ordered a counterattack at once. At 10:58, even as Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu burned uncontrollably, Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The strike, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, followed the return path of the American aircraft and located USS Yorktown shortly after noon. Despite heavy opposition from Wildcat fighters and intense anti-aircraft fire, the Japanese pilots achieved 3 bomb hits. Yorktown was left dead in the water, burning and listing. Damage control teams responded with extraordinary speed and discipline. Against all expectations, the carrier was restored to operational status within 2 hours and resumed movement at approximately 20 knots. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately prepared a second strike. By 1331, however, his available forces had dwindled to just 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero escorts. The mission was led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. Earlier that morning, Tomonaga's aircraft had suffered damage to its left fuel tank. Ground crews could only refuel the right tank before launch. When offered the opportunity to switch aircraft, Tomonaga declined, stating that every operational plane was needed. He was fully aware that his fuel would not last beyond the attack run. At approximately 14:30, Tomonaga's formation located Yorktown, now moving at about 19 knots after further damage control efforts. American fighters tore into the incoming attackers. Tomonaga pressed on even as his aircraft caught fire. According to American observers, his burning plane held its course to the final moment, releasing its torpedo before crashing into the sea. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown at 14:45, ripping open her port side and inducing a severe list of 26 degrees. This time, the damage proved irreparable. Later that afternoon at 17, 24 dive bombers from USS Enterprise located Hiryu. 4 direct hits reduced the final Japanese carrier to another blazing ruin. At 17:03, Admiral Yamaguchi gathered his remaining crew on the slanted flight deck. Survivors later recalled that he apologized for the defeat and urged his men to live on and rebuild Japan's navy. Yamaguchi then returned to the bridge with Hiryu's captain Tomeo Kaku. Both men chose to remain aboard as the carrier sank beneath the waves. Neither body was ever recovered. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi's final transmission to Vice Admiral Nagumo was brief, formal, and steeped in resignation. He expressed remorse for the failure of the operation and ended with a traditional wish for the Emperor's enduring fortune in the war. He would never leave his ship. Yamaguchi was later promoted posthumously to the rank of Vice Admiral. As darkness fell on June 4 and bled into the early hours of June 5, the remnants of Japan's carrier force struggled desperately to save what could no longer be saved. Damage control teams fought fires, flooded compartments, and collapsing structures, but the scale of destruction was beyond recovery. The carrier Soryu was the first to succumb. At 19:13 on June 4, she slipped beneath the surface, carrying 711 officers and men with her. 12 minutes later, at 19:25, Kaga followed, claiming the lives of 811 sailors. At 2 on June 5, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, still hundreds of miles away aboard his flagship Yamato with the main force that had never entered the battle, finally accepted the unavoidable truth. The Midway operation had failed. His signal to the fleet was stark and final. The occupation of Midway was cancelled. All forces were to withdraw. One carrier, however, stubbornly refused to die. Despite catastrophic damage and uncontrollable fires, Akagi remained afloat through the night. Only at dawn at 5 on June 5, after all surviving crew had been removed, did Japanese destroyers administer the final act. 4 torpedoes were fired into her hull. At last, Akagi rolled over and sank, taking 267 men down with her. Kiryu proved equally defiant. She burned throughout the night, her wreckage illuminated by flames visible for miles. At 5:10, she too was deliberately scuttled. When she disappeared beneath the waves, she carried 392 sailors and both of her embarked admirals into the depths. As the sun rose over the Pacific on June 5, the core of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier arm lay shattered on the ocean floor, more than 17,000 feet below the surface. Along with the ships were approximately 3,500 men. Of these losses, 2,181 died aboard the carriers themselves, 267 on Akagi, 811 on Kaga, 392 on Hiryu, and 711 on Soryu. The destruction did not end there. During night maneuvers on June 4, the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, attempting to evade a suspected submarine threat, collided. When American aircraft located them on June 6, the damage proved fatal for Mikuma, which was sunk with the loss of roughly 700 men, the single greatest death toll of any Japanese vessel at Midway. Mogami, badly damaged and with 92 dead, barely managed to limp back to truck. In total, another 792 sailors perished aboard the cruisers. Yet the most strategically devastating loss was not numerical but professional. Only about 110 of the dead were aircrew. Most pilots had survived and been rescued. What Japan could not replace were the more than 700 highly trained aircraft mechanics, flight deck crews, and technical specialists, men whose expertise required years to cultivate. The survivors rescued by destroyers were immediately isolated. They were kept away from the rest of the fleet, confined below decks, and prohibited from speaking to anyone. The priority was not comfort or recovery, it was silence. Even so, the disaster had not yet fully concluded. On June 6, the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, encountered the crippled American carrier Yorktown, which was being towed by the USS Vireo. Tanabe had spent days near Midway collecting weather data and had observed the aerial battles through his periscope. Now, moving slowly at 3 knots, he penetrated the American destroyer screen, accomplishing what the entire Kido Butai had failed to do. At 13:31, Tanabe launched 4 torpedoes from a distance of approximately 1,200 yards. 2 struck Yorktown. Another slammed into the destroyer USS Hammond, which was alongside providing auxiliary power. The destroyer broke in half and sank within 4 minutes, killing 80 sailors, many caught by the detonation of her own depth charges. Yorktown, mortally wounded but stubbornly afloat, refused to sink immediately. Only at 7:01 on June 7 did she finally roll over and disappear into water nearly 16,650 feet deep. This small measure of retribution, the sinking of the carrier that had played a key role in annihilating Japan's carrier force, offered little solace. Against the scale of the defeat, it was almost meaningless. The return voyage to Japan was conducted in humiliation and near total secrecy. Wounded sailors from the carriers were kept in segregated compartments, forbidden from speaking even to fellow crewmen. When the fleet arrived at Hashirajima Naval Base on June 14, the ships anchored under cover of darkness to avoid observation. The wounded were unloaded at night and classified as special secret patients. They were transported to isolated naval hospitals where they were effectively imprisoned, cut off from families, friends, and the outside world. According to later accounts from U.S. Naval Institute sources, many were treated harshly, regarded not as survivors but as disgraced failures. Airgroup survivors were quickly reassigned to remote bases across the South Pacific without leave or contact with loved ones. Most would be killed in the brutal fighting of the Solomon Islands campaign. Carrier crews were scattered among different ships and installations, sworn to silence under threat of severe punishment. The cover-up began immediately. Official records continued to list Akagi and Hiryu as active but unmanned, maintaining the illusion that they still existed. No senior officers were court-martialed or publicly reprimanded. Doing so would have required admitting catastrophe. Even the Imperial Japanese Army was kept unaware of the true scale of the disaster for an entire month. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo himself was not informed of the full extent of the losses. While wreckage still burned at sea on June 5, Tokyo Radio announced triumph. The Japanese public was told that Imperial naval and air forces had inflicted devastating blows on the American fleet. Later broadcasts claimed that 2 U.S. carriers had been sunk. Almost as an afterthought, the loss of cargo was acknowledged, with Soryu admitted later. The destruction of Akagi and Hiryu would not be officially revealed until after the war. Unaware of the truth, civilians celebrated in the streets, cheering what was, in reality, a national calamity. Only on June 10 did the Tokyo press cautiously suggest that the Midway operation had encountered difficulties, while still insisting upon overall success. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, recovering in hospital from an appendectomy and burns suffered during Akagi's destruction, was visited by a naval intelligence officer. He was warned explicitly he was never to speak of what had truly occurred. Officially, Japan had won a great victory. According to post-war accounts, though, these must be treated carefully due to questions surrounding Fuchida's reliability. He responded with bitter remarks about the futility of waging war on falsehoods. Admiral Yamamoto returned to his cabin aboard Yamato and did not emerge for 3 days. His staff heard him pacing through the nights. In private writings discovered only after the war, he confessed despair. Those who served close to him later recalled that he fell into profound depression, convinced that the conflict was now unwinnable. His earlier warning to Prime Minister Kono had proven tragically accurate. Japan, he had said, could rampage unchecked for 6 months, no more. At Midway, that prophecy was fulfilled. 6 months after the shock of Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway fundamentally altered the course of the Pacific War. What had begun as a rapid and seemingly unstoppable Japanese advance now reached its decisive turning point. From this moment onward, the strategic balance shifted quietly at first, but irreversibly. In a confidential discussion with his senior officers, later recorded by Captain Kurashima, Admiral Yamamoto spoke with uncharacteristic candor. He admitted that the gamble had failed. His attempt to eliminate America's aircraft carriers had instead resulted in the catastrophic loss of Japan's own. While the conflict itself was far from over, Yamamoto recognized something far more troubling. The tools required to achieve victory had likely been destroyed. In correspondence with his trusted friend, Rear Admiral Taichi, letters that survived the war Yamamoto reflected even more deeply on the defeat. He rejected the idea that Midway was the result of chance or overwhelming American numbers. Instead, he placed responsibility squarely on Japan's own decisions. Overconfidence had blinded the leadership. Strategic assumptions had gone unchallenged. American industrial strength, adaptability, and tactical skill had been dangerously underestimated, while Japan's own capabilities were exaggerated. Yamamoto warned that this imbalance would exact a terrible cost. In his estimation, Japan had perhaps a year and a half before the situation deteriorated beyond recovery. History would show that even this grim forecast was optimistic. Within 18 months, Japan would lose the Mariana Islands, opening a direct path for American B-29 bombers to strike the Japanese homeland. The consequences of Midway extended far beyond the loss of 4 fleet carriers and approximately 3,500 lives. What truly crippled Japanese naval aviation was the destruction of irreplaceable human capital. More than 100 of Japan's most experienced naval pilots were killed, men who had accumulated years of combat experience across multiple theaters, from China to the Indian Ocean. These were not recruits, but elite aviators whose skills could not be replicated quickly, if at all. The Japanese pilot training system required a combat-ready flyer and significantly longer to develop true mastery. No emergency program could replace such losses. Even more damaging was the death of over 700 specialized ground crew members, mechanics, armorers, and flight deck personnel. These men represented decades of accumulated institutional knowledge. They understood every mechanical nuance of their aircraft and every operational detail of carrier aviation under combat conditions. As Admiral Motomi Ugaki later recorded in his diary documents, eventually captured and translated ships could be replaced within a few years. Expertise could not. Aircraft carriers could be built with steel and labor, but the experience of seasoned pilots and maintenance crews was something Japan would never recover. Ugaki's assessment was blunt. New carriers might be launched within 2 years, but the people who knew how to fight from them effectively were gone forever. From that moment onward, Japanese naval aid. The result was a devastating defeat, later known to Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost more than 600 aircraft while inflicting negligible damage in return. The roots of that disaster could be traced directly back to the waters off Midway. Strategically, Midway marked the end of Japan's expansionist phase. Within the Imperial General Headquarters, reality began to intrude despite official propaganda. Planned offensives against Fiji, Samoa, and even Hawaii were quietly shelved. Operation FS, intended to sever the supply routes between the United States and Australia, was abandoned altogether. Japan was no longer dictating the course of the war. It was reacting, forced into a defensive posture it lacked the resources to sustain. Meanwhile, American confidence surged. With momentum on their side, US planners began laying the groundwork for a counteroffensive. Just 2 months later, the struggle for Guadalcanal would commence, launching a brutal and relentless advance across the Pacific toward Japan itself. The psychological impact of Midway was as profound as its material consequences. Since the victory over Russia at Tsushima in 1905, The Japanese Navy had cultivated an image of invincibility. That illusion was shattered in a matter of minutes when American dive bombers struck the carriers. Commander Tamon Yamaguchi, one of many officers reflecting later, captured the shift succinctly. After Midway, Japanese forces entered battle expecting defeat, while American forces fought with growing certainty of victory. In those few minutes of chaos and fire, the emotional balance of the war had permanently changed. Within the Navy, blame and resentment spread quickly, though never in public. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, despite having followed established doctrine, was singled out as the symbol of failure. He was removed from carrier command and reassigned to shore duties, never again entrusted with Japan's naval air forces. In 1944, during the American invasion of Saipan, where Nagumo commanded ground troops, he chose suicide over capture. Ogaki's diary reflects the internal verdict with chilling clarity. Nagumo's career was effectively over, but the responsibility for defeat could not be allowed to reach Yamamoto himself. Someone had to bear the weight of failure, and Nagumo became that figure. Ultimately, the true tragedy of Midway was not measured in sunken ships but in lost men. It was a defeat from which Japanese naval aviation would never recover, a moment when the war's outcome became not inevitable but increasingly unavoidable. The defeat at Midway did far more than cost Japan 4 aircraft carriers. It laid bare deep-rooted weaknesses embedded within Japanese military culture itself. Patterns of rigid thinking, resistance to improvisation, and unwavering loyalty to doctrine regardless of changing battlefield realities were exposed with brutal clarity. These characteristics were widely acknowledged by Japanese commanders, yet they were so deeply ingrained that meaningful reform proved impossible. The same hierarchical mindset and doctrinal rigidity that produced catastrophe at Midway would resurface repeatedly in later campaigns, compounding Japan's losses as the war progressed. Subsequent post-war events were not the result of a single mistake, but rather a chain reaction of failures that reinforced one another. The Japanese plan was excessively elaborate, dispersing naval and air units across vast stretches of the Pacific. This geographic fragmentation left individual forces isolated, unable to provide mutual support when circumstances changed. Strict adherence to radio silence, treated almost as a sacred rule, further crippled the operation. When events diverged from expectations, Japanese commanders found themselves unable to communicate or coordinate effectively. Intelligence failures played an equally decisive role. Japanese leadership entered the operation dangerously uninformed. They were unaware that American aircraft carriers had already departed port and were maneuvering into position. In contrast, U.S. naval intelligence possessed an extraordinary advantage. Through successful code-breaking, American commanders had near-complete insight into Japanese intentions, timing, and force disposition. Reconnaissance shortcomings proved especially damaging. Japan deployed a painfully small number of search aircraft, only 7 planes tasked with scanning an immense ocean expanse. The Americans, by comparison, utilized more than 30 long-range PBY Catalina patrol aircraft, dramatically increasing their situational awareness. Critical reconnaissance efforts collapsed one by one. Operation K, intended to gather intelligence over Pearl Harbor, was abandoned after American naval activity was detected near the French frigate Shoals. A Japanese submarine assigned to monitor Pearl Harbor arrived too late to observe the departure of U.S. carriers. Most consequentially, the cruiser Tone launched its scout plane 30 minutes behind schedule, a delay that denied Japanese commanders the warning they desperately needed. Any one of these failures might have been survivable in isolation. Together, they made defeat unavoidable. Perhaps the most fatal error lay in systematic misjudgment. Japanese planners consistently underestimated American capabilities while placing unwarranted confidence in their own assumptions. They believed U.S. cryptographers could not penetrate Japanese naval codes, yet they had already done so. They assumed the carrier Yorktown, damaged earlier in the war, would be out of action for months. Instead, American shipyard crews restored her to combat readiness in just 3 days. They dismissed American aviators as poorly trained and ineffective. At Midway, U.S. dive bomber pilots demonstrated lethal precision. They also expected American carriers to arrive only after Midway had fallen. Instead, those carriers were already in position, lying in wait. Carrier survivability exposed another stark contrast. Japanese flat tops were designed with enclosed hangar decks and inadequate firefighting infrastructure. Once hit, fires spread rapidly, transforming the ships into infernos. American carriers, by contrast, featured open hangar designs and superior damage control doctrine. These differences proved decisive. The Yorktown absorbed extraordinary punishment and may well have survived the battle had she not later been struck by a submarine-launched torpedo. Japanese carriers, however, were often doomed by a single successful attack due to vulnerable fuel lines, volatile aircraft handling procedures, and insufficient fire suppression systems. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's carrier strategy, did not live long enough to see the war's conclusion. He understood that Midway had irreversibly shifted the balance of power. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid that helped trigger the events leading to Midway, American intelligence intercepted details of his travel itinerary. U.S. Army Air Force's P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. When his body was later discovered in the jungle, Yamamoto was still seated upright, sword beside him, a symbol of a commander fully aware of the catastrophe that had sealed his nation's fate. In private correspondence written shortly before his death, Yamamoto offered a remarkably candid assessment. Reflecting on Midway, he acknowledged that victory in modern warfare depended on far more than morale or spiritual resolve. Success, he wrote, required accurate intelligence and the judgment to act upon it wisely, both of which Japan lacked. Overconfidence blinded Japanese leadership to the possibility of an American ambush. Inflexibility prevented effective response when the plan unraveled. Arrogance made it unthinkable that their codes could be compromised. Pride, he concluded, had paved the path to ruin. The ultimate irony of Midway lies in how completely it fulfilled Yamamoto's vision, though in reverse. He had sought a decisive naval engagement that would cripple American power in the Pacific. Such a battle did occur, but it was Japan that suffered the decisive blow. The trap designed for the U.S. Navy snapped shut on its creators. The ambush meticulously planned by Japanese strategists became the ambush they endured. The doctrine of the decisive battle, central to Japanese naval thinking for 4 decades, was vindicated in principle, but it was the United States that emerged victorious. Japanese archival records confirm that Yamamoto had long feared America's industrial potential. Early in 1942, he warned his officers against mistaking early successes for final victory. Striking a nation at rest, he argued, was no achievement worthy of pride. What truly mattered was how the enemy would respond once awakened. An angered and mobilized America, he believed, would unleash a relentless counteroffensive. Midway proved him right far sooner than anyone in Tokyo was prepared to accept. At Midway, the American counteroffensive struck with remarkable precision, reversing the momentum Japan had gained after Pearl Harbor. Though the conflict would rage for another 3 years, the battle on June 4, 1942, effectively determined the trajectory of the Pacific War. In those few critical minutes, Japanese naval power suffered a blow from which it never fully recovered. Beyond the strategic implications, Midway was a profound human catastrophe. Approximately 3,570 Japanese sailors and airmen lost their lives in the waters roughly 325 miles northwest of the island. These were young men who had written their final letters that morning, shared simple breakfasts of rice and tea, and held personal dreams of returning home and achieving victory. They perished in terrifying ways, engulfed by flames exceeding 1,000 degrees, drowning in oil-slicked seas, or obliterated by explosions so intense that their echoes traveled for miles. Lieutenant Hashimoto, one of the rare survivors from the engine room of Akagi, recounted the horrors during post-war investigations. The memories of men burning alive still haunt him. Blocked passages, ladders melted by the heat, left them powerless to save anyone. They could only listen to cries for mothers, water, or relief from pain, cries that have lingered in his mind ever since. Back in Japan, families were shielded from the grim reality. They received official reports claiming their sons had perished heroically in service of the emperor, celebrating a triumph that never occurred. Gold stars were displayed in windows, symbols of pride and devotion, yet they masked the truth. Their children had died in a defeat that sealed the nation's fate. The real story only emerged after Japan's surrender, and even then, many families struggled to accept the deception. Petty Officer Tanaka, survivor of Soryu's destruction, recalled the day before the battle with stark contrast. Confidence ran high. Sailors joked about sinking enemy vessels, making bold claims of downing aircraft and targeting battleships. Yamada had vowed to destroy a battleship, Suzuki, to shoot down 5 planes, both only 18 years old. Neither survived the bombs, and their remains were never recovered. They now rest with their fellow crew members in the depths of the Pacific, waiting silently at stations that will never see action again. The 4 carriers destroyed at Midway now lie over 17,000 feet underwater, their precise locations revealed only decades later by oceanographer Robert Ballard and subsequent deep-sea explorations. They serve as submerged memorials, testimonies to hubris and the immense toll of war. Aircraft that once launched from their decks to dominate the Pacific are now crushed within the hangar decks, their crews' remains left as eternal sentinels of vessels that will never sail again. From Japan's perspective, Midway marked the collision of ambition with harsh reality. It revealed that moral resolve alone cannot compensate for material disadvantage, that bravery without strategy can invite disaster, and that rigid doctrines cannot adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The defeat at Midway shattered illusions of invincibility, of spiritual superiority over material strength, and of the belief that sheer determination could surmount any obstacle. In its aftermath, Japan confronted the sobering truth. It had engaged in a war against an underestimated adversary, relying on outdated tactics in an era of modern warfare. Yet, the catastrophe also paved the way for transformation. Post-war Japan abandoned militarism, embraced democratic principles, and emerged as a nation devoted to peace, innovation, and prosperity. The warrior ethos that once fueled conquest was redirected, channeling resilience and discipline into rebuilding and technological advancement rather than imperial ambition. Midway, therefore, was both an end and a beginning, a devastating loss that closed one chapter of Japanese history and heralded the birth of another. The nation that once sought to extend its reach across the Pacific has since transformed into a guardian of its stability. The industrial and technological skills once devoted to constructing aircraft carriers and warships now drive the production of automobiles, electronics, and advanced technology. In this evolution, it is possible to see that the 3,573 lives lost at Midway were not entirely sacrificed in vain. Beyond the immediate tactical outcomes, the battle serves as a stark reminder of the perils of hubris and inflexible strategic thinking. The Japanese military, despite remarkable operational skill and extraordinary bravery, fell prey to its own previous victories, a phenomenon often described as victory disease. Leaders assumed that methods which had proven successful before would continue to work, that adversaries would act predictably, and that courage alone could compensate for material disadvantages. These assumptions undermined decision-making at every level. The same fleet that executed the Pearl Harbor attack with precision 6 months earlier failed at basic reconnaissance, neglected critical intelligence, and stumbled into a trap that should have been apparent. When examining Midway from a Japanese viewpoint, it becomes clear that this was not a tale of villains but of humans ensnared by the machinery of war. Young aviators flew into near-certain death with determination, if not strategic foresight. Commanders made urgent choices under intense pressure with limited information. Mechanics labored desperately to ready aircraft they would never see returned. Sailors fought uncontrollable fires while remaining at their stations until the very end. Their experiences demand acknowledgement, not to glorify loss or warfare, but to record the immense costs of military ambition and imperial expansion. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, despite controversies regarding the accuracy of his post-war accounts, exemplified a remarkable personal transformation. After the war, he became a Christian evangelist, dedicating his later years to preaching reconciliation. While his individual recollections must be approached with caution, his journey from orchestrating Pearl Harbor to advocating for peace mirrors Japan's own post-war trajectory from militarism to pacifism, from imperial ambition to democracy, and from isolation to global engagement. The strategic lessons from Midway, as seen through the Japanese lens, are unequivocal. No nation, regardless of power, can afford to underestimate opponents, overrate its own strength, or disregard the evolving nature of warfare. Carriers that seemed untouchable at Pearl Harbor were fatally exposed at Midway. Pilots who had previously dominated the skies were outmatched by coordinated American dive bombing attacks. Tactics that had succeeded against fragmented enemies proved ineffective against a well-informed, unified force. Ultimately, the same waters that claimed the Japanese carriers at Midway would, symbolically, sweep away the militaristic ethos that had driven Japan into the conflict. The young servicemen who perished were motivated by loyalty to their emperor and nation, unaware that their deaths would indirectly herald the rise of a peaceful, prosperous, and democratic Japan. Although their sacrifice did not yield tactical advantage and resulted in strategic disaster, it underscored the futility of aggression and the impossibility of sustaining empire through coercion. Midway, from the Japanese perspective, is a narrative of human error compounded by overconfidence, of courage meeting harsh reality, and of the heavy toll exacted by strategic misjudgment. This account is not meant to celebrate defeat or triumph, but to emphasize the immense human cost of war. The ocean that engulfed the Japanese carriers now serves as a silent testament to lessons learned, that militarism brings destruction, that aggression sows loss, and that lasting strength is rooted not in conquest but in cooperation and peace. The memory of Midway, both Japanese and American, illustrates that war is never glorious and victories are rarely without tragedy. In the depths of the Pacific, where countless carriers rest, the only enduring sound is the rhythm of the waves, a quiet reminder of humanity's most expensive lesson: war, regardless of outcome, results in irreplaceable loss.